Welcome back to Newsfeed PM. Let's give you some business news. Now, former Reserve Bank Governor Tito Mboweni has been hailed as one of the prominent figures that pushed key economic policies in the country. Mboweni had an illustrious career that saw him serve as Labour Minister in 1994 before tackling monetary policy at the Reserve Bank between 1999 to 2009. He later returned to government as Finance Minister from 2018 to 2021 as a man tasked with the huge responsibility of guiding South Africa out of the shaky fiscal period. Here to reflect on the former Governor and Finance Minister's life and legacy is Ayabonga Cawe, the Chief Commissioner at the International Trade Administration Commission of South Africa. Ayabonga, now as an economist, I'm sure you would have gone through a lot of the former ministers and governors' speeches, either as Reserve Bank Governor or the Finance Minister. Just your reflection over the years, just how tough that job was coming out of apartheid and coming up with policies that will take South Africa forward.
Well, thank you very much, Muteo, and good afternoon to your viewers. Certainly a sad day indeed, I think, for the policy community in South Africa. We do keep in our thoughts Tito Mboweni's family. And indeed, you're correct. He's had an illustrious and a very long career in the public service. And he certainly is one of a generation of South Africans, patriots who were the principal architects of our policy and institutional landscape as we understand it. Long before he became a governor of the central bank, he was very much involved and provided political stewardship to the architecture of or the legion of legal instruments that we have to ensure decent work, be it the Labour Relations Act or the Basic Conditions of Employment Act or the Employment Equity Act. Many of those pieces of legislation emerged and were developed at a time where he was the political steward of the Department of Labour. And so certainly even his subsequent roles, whether one had to agree with him or not, one can say without a shadow of a doubt that he certainly made his immeasurable contribution. And we certainly doff our hat to him.
A lot of the trust deficit, if you will, from international markets, post-apartheid, South Africa, a young democracy. How do you think he won the markets over in terms of the way he did things?
Well, I think whether he won the markets over or not, I think we probably have to do or maybe set our own assessment of his legacy beyond just what the markets thought of him. He was somebody who brought the work of the central bank much closer to South African people, instituting certain things that we now take for granted. The fact that now there is a media press statement and a process following the meetings of the Monetary Policy Committee to much pomp and fanfare has a lot to do with him, his personality, and how he saw his role as a public servant, having come as he did, I think, from the traditions of the mass movement in South Africa. And so in many ways, wherever he did lead, he did leave his imprint. He was someone with very strong views. I had an opportunity to interact with him, not only in my own work in the media, but also as a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. And often found him to be somebody who certainly, would play and express his view with a very straight bat. And so I think he'll be missed for that. And a lot of the kind of personality that was on display in the nighttime cuisine was very much also on display in many of his engagements with his colleagues.
He also, of course, introduced the South African Reserve Bank's inflation targeting method to our local market under his leadership. We have the benefit of hindsight now. Is it a policy that you think has worked, especially for our social economic problems as a country?
Well, I think, that's probably an area where I would have differed with, the eighth governor of the central bank. But indeed, it was a reform that was very much part of the macroeconomic package of the time. In hindsight and with kind of perfect 2020 foresight, I think the debate is still open. Many people are saying the inflation target should be lowered. But many of us have always held a view that the cause of the inflation matters too, and therefore the transmission belt of higher interest rates into not only the financial and real estate parts of the economy, but into the real economy, manufacturing, on the plant floor, has certainly been mixed at best and probably has had a disastrous impact on dampening capital investment in manufacturing. But people are complex. People hold different vantage points and views. And certainly, one would not say that my own personal differences with inflation targeting are fundamental to my own assessment of Tito Mboweni's legacy. There are many areas where I would have agreed with him. On the state bank, for instance, right to the last, he held a view that we needed reform of our financial services sector and public involvement in the financial services sector. And that's certainly a view that I would hold. And similarly, one can't run away from the immeasurable task he would have had in stewarding the national treasury during the COVID-19 pandemic. A special adjustment budget that had to be passed in addition to a budget that in February 2019 had been passed, reprioritization had to happen, and many other decisions for which he drew a lot of criticism from many people, including myself. I would say that he certainly, in hindsight on that score, did a very important job at a difficult time, once in a kind of lifetime crisis, a warlike situation. And he certainly, held the line insofar as that is concerned. And there were areas now in hindsight where one might say, some of his views, whether, we liked it or not, were strong, but indeed correct. I mean, one of the issues is around the role of debt service costs in our fiscal framework. And whether one agrees or not with kind of the pursuit of a primary surplus, I don't. One might take a view, of course, that he was able to kind of place the choices in stark contrast. Do we want more of these hard-won rands from the South African people to go into the pockets of bondholders who tend to be rich? It's certainly not the outcome that anyone interested in reducing inequality would want, because that would be an upward distribution of income in the world's most unequal society. And so those were some of the difficult choices that he would have faced at the helm of the National Treasury. And I think on some of those areas, history will judge him favorably. But there are also areas where I think his very strong views elicited very mixed responses. And that's the mark of the man, a man of many seasons, that even his legacy at the helm of many of these institutions remains contested.
He didn't strike me as someone who cared too much about being popular or having a popular view in the room. You worked with him. You must have debated with him numerous times. Do you remember a time anecdotally that you can share with us where you had a difference in ideas and you were able to, hold the room together, and he was able to accept those new ideas? Because if you look at him, his life, he was basically the beacon of economic policy in the country.
Well, Mutewa, I didn't work with him as closely as many of my colleagues would have. As I said, my interactions with him in kind of a professional space were with him as part of a collective of colleagues in the economic cluster, and of course chaired by the president. I often found his views very strong on many issues. And certainly our task was not to kind of persuade one another. But my one enduring impression of him was always his ability to use every single moment of contestation and engagement as a learning and a teachable moment. And whether or not in some instances one was willing to listen to some of those lessons, I think is open to discussion. But I think the point I'm making, Mutewa, is that here you had a patriot whose loyalty to South Africa was unquestioned, whether you agreed with him or not. But he certainly is part of a generation that unfortunately I think is reaching kind of the end of their natural lives, who dedicated much of their youth at great cost to themselves and to their families to the struggle for freedom. And after that struggle and the breakthrough in 1994 continued to commit themselves to the reconstruction of our society, to the building of institutions. And so I remember him as that. I remember him as somebody who was the principal architect for our, labor legislation and labor law regime, as someone who made an immeasurable contribution to the central bank, but also I think somebody who made an immeasurable contribution to the policy landscape in different roles. And certainly the diversity and plurality of economic ideas that we need in South Africa will certainly record his own indelible contribution in that evolving experience of statecraft.